The case, on the surface, appeared simple. Just another routine foreclosure dispute over a property the bank claimed was legally theirs. A cold, bureaucratic process. A matter of contracts, numbers, and signatures. To the court, it was just another house. To James Carter, it was everything. The house had belonged to his mother. It wasn't just a building. It was the place where birthdays were celebrated, where home-cooked meals filled the air with warmth, where his mother had spent her last days surrounded by the memories of a life well lived. To the bank, it was nothing more than an asset on a spreadsheet. But James refused to let them take it without a fight. When the foreclosure notice arrived, it felt like a gut punch. The bank claimed that his mother had defaulted on payments, that the property had gone through all the necessary legal processes before landing in their possession. But something about it didn't sit right with James. His mother had always been responsible with her finances. She had always paid her mortgage on time. How could she have suddenly fallen so far behind that they were seizing the home? Doubt turned to determination. James wasn't a lawyer. He didn't have a legal team, a financial advisor, or a high-powered firm backing him. But he had something else, the will to fight. He spent days, then weeks, then months in the public library, poring over foreclosure laws, real estate statutes, and case histories. He studied everything: banking practices, predatory lending, forged signatures, and fraudulent transfers. He followed every paper trail, every loophole banks used to take homes from unsuspecting families. And then he found something. It started as a small inconsistency, a discrepancy buried deep within the paperwork, a signature that didn't match, a document that had been notarized under suspicious circumstances. The deeper he dug, the more red flags appeared. Loan transfers that lacked proper endorsements. Modifications that had been rushed through without legal verification. Paperwork with missing or altered dates. He followed the trail relentlessly, piece by piece, connecting the dots until the full picture emerged. The foreclosure wasn't just questionable, it was illegal. The bank hadn't followed the law at all. They had taken shortcuts, fabricated documents, and pushed through the foreclosure using paperwork that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. But they never expected anyone to look closely. They certainly didn't expect someone like James, a man with no legal background, no formal training, to uncover their deception. That's what they were counting on. Banks and corporate law firms thrived on the assumption that most people wouldn't question them, that homeowners would either be too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back. But James wasn't intimidated, and he wasn't exhausted. He was ready. Armed with 6 months of research, carefully collected evidence, and a resolve stronger than steel, he stepped into the courtroom, knowing one thing for certain. They had underestimated the wrong man. Langston rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his demeanor effortless. This was his domain, the courtroom, the strategy, the control. He had stood in front of countless juries, argued hundreds of cases, and crushed more opponents than he could count. And now, standing before the jury, he was about to do it again. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting the room settle into silence before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and polished, "this is not complicated." He glanced toward James, but barely acknowledged him, as if he were nothing more than an afterthought, an inconvenience delaying the inevitable. "The law is clear," Langston continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "My client, a respected financial institution, legally acquired this property. The process was followed correctly. The paperwork is in order. There is no ambiguity, no gray area. It's all right here in black and white." He gestured toward the neatly stacked legal documents on his table, a physical representation of his confidence. "Mr. Carter, unfortunately, failed to meet his financial obligations," he continued, his voice lowering slightly as if he regretted having to say it. "And while losing a home is undoubtedly a painful experience, emotions do not override legal responsibility." He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. He had perfected this rhythm, this calculated balance between logic and sympathy. He wasn't just arguing facts, he was shaping perception. "This isn't about sympathy," he said, shaking his head slightly. "This is about contracts, signatures, and deadlines. My client followed the law." Langston turned slightly, finally looking toward James, his expression calm but dismissive. Mr. Carter did not. Another pause. This time, he let his words linger in the air, unchallenged. The weight of legal authority, of procedural correctness, was on his side, and everyone in the room knew it. With a practiced motion, he buttoned his jacket, walked back to his seat, and sat down, folding his hands neatly in front of him. In his mind, the case was already decided. There was nothing left to say. James, however, knew better. He had been waiting for this moment. He had listened carefully, absorbing every word. Langston's argument was polished, convincing, designed to make his opponent feel small, insignificant, incapable of fighting back. But James wasn't small. He had spent 6 months preparing for this exact situation. He had read every statute, every precedent, every technicality that Langston thought he could bury beneath legal jargon. He had studied the patterns, the carefully crafted narratives that corporate lawyers used to bulldoze over people who didn't know any better. But James knew better. As he rose from his seat, he felt the weight of every sleepless night, every document he had pored over, every moment of doubt he had silenced. He took a breath, steadied himself, and stepped forward. Now it was his turn. James stood, taking a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. His heartbeat was steady, his hands firm. Every eye in the courtroom was on him now, waiting, expecting a weak rebuttal to Langston's well-rehearsed argument. But James had come prepared. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and spoke with calm confidence. "Mr. Langston is right about one thing. The law is clear." He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "The question is, did his client actually follow it?" A flicker of irritation crossed Langston's face. James didn't wait for a response. He turned to the judge, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I would like to submit a motion for discovery. I have reason to believe the plaintiff is hiding something." For the first time since the case began, Judge Westbrook looked up with genuine interest. His eyes, which had held a mild indifference before, sharpened. "Hiding what, Mr. Carter?" James didn't hesitate. He turned and met Langston's gaze, his words sharp and deliberate. "Fraud." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The tension, once thick with the assumption of James's failure, had shifted. Now it was something else, uncertainty, the kind that made people lean forward, listening more closely. Langston let out a short, forced breath, shifting in his seat. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to stall." James didn't let him finish. "Tell me, Mr. Langston," James said, taking a step toward the plaintiff's table. "How standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house using a mortgage document with 2 different signatures from the same person?" Silence. No one moved. James reached for a folder on his table, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the bailiff, handing him 2 versions of the same document. "This," he said, turning back to the judge, "is the mortgage agreement, Your Honor. The first signature is from the original filing. The second is from a modification 3 months later." James paused, letting the judge take in the information. "But if you compare them," he continued, his voice unshaken, "you'll notice they don't match." The judge furrowed his brow and leaned forward, scanning the documents. The room was so quiet that even the faint sound of paper shifting beneath the judge's fingers seemed loud. Judge Westbrook flipped between the 2 signatures, his expression darkening. He looked up. "Mr. Langston, do you have an explanation for this?" Langston cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "Signatures change over time." His voice lacked the easy confidence he had displayed earlier. James took another step forward. "Maybe," he admitted, tilting his head. But this second signature was dated one day after my mother was admitted to the hospital following a stroke. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Langston's jaw tightened. James let that revelation settle before delivering the final blow. She couldn't even hold a pen, he said, his voice unwavering, let alone sign legal documents. The murmurs grew louder now, people whispering, glancing at each other, shifting in their seats. The jury members leaned forward, some glancing between James and Langston. Judge Westbrook turned back to the documents, his fingers tapping absently against the bench. Then, he turned his gaze back to Langston, his voice measured but firm. Mr. Langston, he said, this is a serious claim. Do you have any documentation to support your assertion that this signature is legitimate? Langston opened his mouth but closed it again, choosing his words carefully. We would need time to retrieve additional records, Your Honor, he said finally. James smirked, just slightly. That's fine, he said, his voice calm. I'll wait. The silence that followed wasn't just intrigue anymore. It was doubt. Langston, the man who had walked into this courtroom with complete confidence, was starting to unravel. And James wasn't done yet. Judge Westbrook's tone sharpened, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun spreading through the courtroom. Mr. Langston, he said, fixing the attorney with a steady gaze, does your client have the original signed documents on file? Langston hesitated. It was brief, just a fraction of a second, but James saw it. More importantly, so did the judge. Langston cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. James allowed himself a small, knowing smile. That's fine, he said simply. I'll wait. The silence in the courtroom deepened. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was doubt. The air felt different now, heavier with the weight of unspoken questions. But James wasn't done. Keeping his movements measured, he reached into his folder, retrieving another document. He held it up as he spoke. Your Honor, he continued, stepping toward the judge, the loan attached to this foreclosure was sold 3 times before it landed with the plaintiff. He paused for effect, letting the weight of that statement settle. But there's something missing. Judge Westbrook extended his hand, and James walked the document over to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the paperwork intently. His forehead creased. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest of his chair. Then, after a long pause, he looked up. There's no signature on the last transfer, he stated, his tone sharp. James nodded. Exactly. He turned slightly, addressing the jury now. Which means the plaintiff never legally owned this loan. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who knew he had just cracked the case wide open. A few jurors exchanged glances. Others leaned forward, brows furrowed, processing what had just been revealed. James turned back toward the judge. And a bank that doesn't own the loan, he said, can't foreclose on the house. A ripple of hushed whispers coursed through the gallery. The courtroom was no longer a place of quiet certainty for the prosecution. Instead, it was thick with the unmistakable scent of doubt. Langston, who had been sitting in easy confidence at the start of the trial, suddenly sat up straighter. His polished demeanor was cracking. Your Honor, he started, but his voice caught. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. This is irrelevant. Judge Westbrook slowly removed his glasses, setting them down on the bench with deliberate care. He exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then, he shook his head. No, Mr. Langston, he said. This is a problem. Langston's mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but no words came. His fingers curled around the edges of his legal pad, gripping it just a little too tightly. James could see it. The man who had walked into this courtroom with complete confidence, who had smirked at him, dismissed him, and treated this case like a mere formality, was unraveling. And James wasn't done yet. James wasn't done yet. He could feel the momentum shifting in his favor, but he knew he had to drive the final nail into the coffin. The truth was about to come out, and he wanted every person in that courtroom to witness it firsthand. He took a deep breath and turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Langston shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the polished courtroom floor. His voice was sharp, tinged with something that almost sounded like panic. This witness was not disclosed beforehand. James met Langston's glare without hesitation. His voice remained calm, unshaken. "That's because I only just tracked her down yesterday," he said. His eyes never left Langston's as he added, "And what she told me changes everything." A murmur ran through the room. People shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, anticipation building like an electric charge in the air. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped inside. Emily Rhodes, a notary public, walked toward the witness stand. She looked tense, her fingers gripping the strap of her handbag as she made her way past the rows of spectators. The gallery watched in silence, eyes bouncing between James, Langston, and the woman who now stood at the center of it all. She took the oath with a shaky voice, then sat down, adjusting her glasses as she glanced nervously at Langston. James approached the stand, his steps slow and deliberate. He could see the tension in her posture, the way she avoided looking at Langston. "Miss Rhodes," he began, his voice steady. "Do you recall notarizing the mortgage modification for my mother?" Emily hesitated. "Just for a second." "I do," she answered finally, shifting in her seat. James nodded. "Were you present when she signed it?" The question hung in the air. Emily swallowed, her hands tightening around the edges of the witness stand. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face, her eyes darting toward Langston, who sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, like a wave crashing over a rocky shore, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. James took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "Then how was it notarized?" Emily let out a shaky breath. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. She hesitated, but the weight of the truth was too heavy to hold back any longer. "A bank representative handed me the document," she confessed. "I was told it had already been signed. I just needed to stamp it." Chaos erupted. The courtroom exploded into hushed whispers and exclamations. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth in shock. One of the jurors leaned forward, brows furrowed. The judge's gavel struck down, demanding order. Langston looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. His face paled as he reached for a glass of water, his fingers trembling slightly. James turned back to Judge Westbrook, who was now staring intently at Emily, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," James said, his voice carrying through the tense silence that followed. "The foreclosure was based on fraudulent documents. The evidence is right in front of you." The gavel struck once more. The final battle had begun. The courtroom held its breath. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. Eyes darted between Judge Westbrook, who sat in deep contemplation, and James Carter, who stood firm, unwavering. Langston, once the picture of arrogance and control, now sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped together, his jaw clenched. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Judge Westbrook exhaled, shifting slightly in his chair. Then, with careful precision, he lifted his gavel and tapped it against the bench. The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed through the silent room. His voice, when he finally spoke, was firm. "The court rules in favor of the defendant," he declared. "The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately." The words struck like thunder. A moment of silence followed as the realization settled over the courtroom. And then it hit. A rush of whispered conversations rippled through the gallery. People turned to one another, eyes wide, murmuring in disbelief. James closed his eyes for just a second, allowing himself to take it in. The fight, the months of research, the sleepless nights, the doubt, the frustration, It had all led to this. And now, the house that had been stolen from his mother, the home that held generations of memories, was safe. He had done it. Langston let out a slow, heavy breath, his once confident posture sinking into the chair. His case had fallen apart piece by piece, and now there was nothing left for him to argue. He stared at the judge, but there was no lifeline to grasp. He had lost. James looked over at the jury. A few of them nodded at him, as if silently acknowledging the battle he had fought and won. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was justice. And for the first time in months, James felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Relief. Outside the courthouse, James Carter stepped onto the sunlit steps and let out a long, measured breath. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for months had finally lifted. It wasn't gone completely. Battles like these left their mark. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe without feeling like he was fighting for air. The city hummed around him. Cars honked in the distance. Pedestrians walked by, some barely noticing him, others sneaking glances as they whispered amongst themselves. "Did you see that?" one man murmured to his friend. "That guy should be a lawyer," another voice chimed in. James heard them, but he didn't react. He didn't need validation. He never had. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone except himself. Then, a voice called from behind him. "Carter." James turned, recognizing the voice before he even saw the man. Judge Westbrook stood at the top of the courthouse steps, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his robe. The man who had once looked at James with skepticism, who had barely masked his amusement at the thought of him representing himself, now regarded him with something different. Respect. "You surprised me in there," the judge admitted, his deep voice carrying over the noise of the street. James smirked, tilting his head slightly. "You weren't the only one." Westbrook let out a small chuckle, nodding as if acknowledging a worthy opponent. He studied James for a moment, the same critical look he had given him at the start of the trial. Only now it wasn't laced with doubt. "Ever thought about law school?" the judge asked. James let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Not really." Westbrook raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Might want to reconsider," he said. "You've got a talent for making people squirm." With that, he turned and walked back inside, disappearing through the heavy courthouse doors. James stood there for a moment, watching the judge leave, thinking about what he had just said. Law school. The idea had never crossed his mind before. He wasn't the type to sit in lecture halls, memorizing case law and writing legal briefs. He had always believed justice was something you had to take for yourself, not something hidden behind degrees and expensive suits. But today had proven something to him. Power didn't belong to those with money and titles. It belonged to those who refused to back down. It belonged to people like him. James looked out at the city stretched before him. He had spent months feeling small, feeling like a single voice against a massive system designed to silence people like him. But he hadn't stayed quiet. He hadn't given up, even when everyone expected him to. And if this case had proven anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove. And when they get their chance, they don't just win. They change everything. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong at the table. The world is full of people who will doubt you, dismiss you, and try to make you feel small. They will tell you that you don't have the right education, the right connections, or the right experience. But none of that matters if you have the courage to stand your ground. If you know what's right, stand up, speak up, and fight for it. Justice isn't just for those with money or power. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. Strength isn't measured by titles or wealth. It's measured by determination, by the willingness to go against the odds, and by the refusal to accept defeat. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing firm even when the odds are stacked against you. It's about believing in yourself when no one else does. Because when you refuse to back down, you're more powerful than you think. And sometimes, the underestimated, the overlooked, and the dismissed are the ones who change everything. The world belongs to those who stand up and fight for it. Make sure your voice is heard.